and welcome to this session at the WOW event. My name's Deborah Coles, and I'm really delighted to be able to chair this event. I'm the co-director of a charity called Inquest, which works on deaths in custody, and I've got a lot of experience of working on the deaths of women in prison. I'm also a trustee for two wonderful organisations, Clean Break Theatre Company and Women in Prison, and I hope to get the opportunity to say something about that later on. The way we're going to run this afternoon is that I'm going to do a brief introduction to Vicky Pryce, and then we'll ask a few questions which will draw out some of Vicky's experience and of course, the detail of her book. And then we'll open it out to the audience for you to have questions and hopefully have a conversation about, I think, what is a very neglected area, and that is the issue of women in prison. Now, many of you will know Vicky Pryce because of recent media attention because of her book. But I feel slightly in awe of this amazing woman because she's actually a world-renowned economist. She's been the chief economist of a number of banks and big businesses, one of few women, I should say, and has been involved with KPMG as well. And she was the Director General of the Department of Business and Innovation Skills in government, and the first woman head of the government's economic service. So she is a woman of many skills, and of course is the author of this new publication, Prisonomics. And I will kind of begin, Vicky, by asking you what the catalyst was for you to write this book.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction. Well, of course, I went to prison, so if I hadn't gone, I probably wouldn't have written this book, I have to say. And I want to add immediately that it's not an experience I would recommend to anyone, even though, of course, I didn't spend very long, and I'm astonished as to how women can survive sometimes for a decade or more. Certainly very often for a number of years, although the majority of women, of course, go in for very short periods of time, having committed very trivial offences. Going in, of course, and experiencing it for me was quite a sort of life-changing event. And what struck me, in fact, very quickly the moment I got in was how vulnerable the women were that I was meeting, and also how depressed, really, having been mainly separated from their families. And it's quite an extraordinary thing about women that, although if you look at the population as a whole, only about, I think, 9% of women with children are lone parents. Women with children in prison, about a third of them are lone parents. So you can see what the impact is for them immediately. And as soon as I came out, I started actually looking at some of the statistics, and I'll go back in a minute to what happened when I was in there. And what was clear, looking at all the stuff that the various penal reform agencies and the Prison Reform Trust are putting together is showing, is that if a child is separated from their mother, only about 5% of children stay in their home. They get moved. They very rarely get moved if the father goes to prison. So it immediately struck me that there is something sort of special about women and women issues that we need to be looking at. The second thing, of course, I mean, having discovered the vulnerability of many of them, of course, who had been abused already as children. There's some incredible statistics of 53% of women who end up in prison have been sexually, emotionally or physically abused. A very large number have been taking drugs before. There is a special figure for remand prisoners in particular that over 50% of them are drug dependent when they find themselves in prison. 40% of the women who are actually sentenced also have committed some offence which is drug related. They may have stolen to feed their habit or their habit of their partners or their pimp, because there are quite a lot of prostitutes, of course, in prison. And And you realize when you look at all that, you look at the figures particularly of sexual violence in the home and also domestic violence more generally, and how much more prominent that is for women who end up in prison. Then you look at their academic achievements. I would say that more than half of women in prison have no qualifications whatsoever. They very often don't have any jobs. And when they come out, they hardly get any jobs. And they are, in fact, if you like, the socially disadvantaged group that we send to prison. Quite a lot of men, of course, are in the same position, but it seems to be a lot more prevalent in women. So first of all, it was the realization the moment I got in, and people started talking to me that this was the case. The second thing, of course, is I am an economist, whether we like it or not. And in many ways, you have to survive in prison somehow. And I went in expecting to survive it and absolutely determined to do so, because I was convinced I was going to go to prison during my trial, especially when the second trial started after the first one was called off and the jury was dismissed. I was quite convinced that that was what was going to happen. So I had got myself completely mentally prepared, and I believed I was going to be resilient. Of course, I didn't know what to expect, so I could have been proven to be completely and utterly wrong. But there are ways of coping, and one way of coping for me was certainly stepping back a little bit and looking at it as a bit as a research project too. I had to survive it, but writing and reading is really, really important when you find yourself away from your family and the outside world. It keeps you in touch with, if you like, reality. It allows you to continue to communicate, perhaps, and think that you can give something back when you come out. And it is actually quite a good thing to be doing. But also, it was obvious to me that if I were able to make some sense of what was going on, or at least prove that it doesn't make sense, which is what the book in the end says, I would be talking on behalf of all these women, many of them can't read or write, who I found in prison, and putting their case and explaining why the prison system we have is not fit for purpose. It wastes too much money on things that can be dealt with much more cheaply in society, and it can have much better outcomes in terms of crime and reoffending rates. And that's the sort of book I wrote. It is in the form of a diary, but then, given that I got a feel of what the issues were, I checked it all with people on the outside. Various friends started sending me the Corsten report, Baroness Corsten did in 2007 about women in prison. I wasn't aware of any of that. I didn't have a clue of what the issues were by women in prison and who had written. I had never really bothered to look at this. And I feel in a way, slightly guilty about this, because as was explained by Deborah, I was joint head of the Government Economic Service. One of my jobs, in addition to working for the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, was to ensure that policy was following evidence, and that the various government departments were doing various things based on what the evidence was telling them, or at least that the economists were telling the ministers the right things. And of course I made sure that there were senior enough economists in all the departments, including the Home Office and the Justice Department, where when I got to government, I discovered that there were very low-based economists working in those departments, and I managed to upgrade them and make sure that they were high up in the organization and listened to. So I assumed that the whole case of anything to do with the police, the criminal justice system, and so on, was dealt with properly, and decisions were made that actually followed evidence. It was quite clear to me once I got to prison and then looked at the data afterwards that wasn't the case in that area, and I had never really focused enough on that subject. It was clear to me, and it must be clear to anyone who looks at the statistics, that we seem to imprison twice as many people now that we did just 20 years ago. We imprison something like 10 times as many as we did before the Second World War, and yet our population has not increased by anything of that amount. And at that period, crime, certainly in the last 20 years, has been falling very significantly, and the two are not related at all. If you do any sort of correlation with the statistics, you'll find, and do econometric work, you'll find there is no link between putting more people in prison and crime reduction. Crime has been reducing because of technological reasons. It's much more difficult right now to steal a car. It's much more difficult take the radio out of a car as we used to do in the past. I don't know if you remember, those of you old enough, remember how we used to take the radio out every night and shove it in the house and then put it back in, or in the boot, and hope the car wasn't getting stolen, and put it back in the morning. Now you can't do that. It's all computer, it works through a sort of computer which you can't probably emulate if you steal it. You can't get insurance unless you lock your house properly with, your windows have locks and you have burglar alarms. And in addition, there's been a huge reduction in retail crime. Retailers used to calculate or count in advance the amount of money that they would lose at the end of each day, because whoever manned the tills would pocket maybe a tenner here and there. Now, of course, with quite sophisticated cash desks, which tell you exactly what's happening on every moment that any product sort of passes through some sort of chain in the shop. You can't do that anymore. So there's been a huge reduction in that too. So overall crime has declined very substantially, whether you look at reported crime, which of course doesn't actually tell you the whole story, or if you look at the crime survey statistics. And yet we seem to be putting many more people in jail, including many more women. And as I mentioned at the beginning, many of them are there for very, very trivial reasons. So I met lots of people in there, wrote a diary about my time, and then substantiated it all by using lots of researchers from the outside. I worked with the Institute of Criminology in Cambridge. I had 3 other people who looked at all the data that was out there. I spoke to everyone I could speak to. In fact, Deborah, you're probably the first person I spoke to. We didn't actually meet, but you sent me some stuff, and from then it escalated into sort of talking to and meeting most of the organizations which are involved in penal reform. So the book ends with a whole part of it looking at the economics and argues that it's not fit for purpose because the value, the sort of cost-benefit analysis is negative. So what happens, of course, is that when women come out and men come out of jail, they tend to reoffend. 45% of women who commit an offence and get released get reconvicted within the first year of being out. And of course, they probably offend a lot more. It doesn't mean they get sent to jail, but they get reconvicted somehow. They get some conviction. They probably have offended as well a lot more than the conviction rate would suggest. And if you're a repeat offender, the chances of coming out of jail and then reoffending is infinitely greater. For anyone who's already committed 10 offences, the chances of reoffending is 90%. And the thing I'd like people to compare it with is if you had a knee problem and you went to a hospital to have a knee operation, and a year later you went back into the same hospital to have exactly the same operation, and a year later you did the same again, you'd close that hospital. You'd think again really about what the purpose of this is and whether it's actually leading to any improvement. Certainly the academic research I did and the evidence suggests that if anything, going to prison increases the likelihood of reoffending. The prison itself is not a deterrent for crime. Alternatives such as community sentences and special women's centres, which do this amazing stuff since the Corson Review came out and lots of funding has gone into them, can reduce reoffending very significantly. Reoffending itself costs us about anywhere between 9.5 and 13 billion pounds a year. If you reduce that by even 10%, you have quite a substantial saving. And if you reduce the number of people in prison and then spend the time, the amount of money that you had and the time of prison officers, because after all that costs, it's an opportunity cost there, every economist will tell you, to proper rehabilitation for the ones who are there and proper education. I mean, there is a 100 million budget by the Department for Business which goes into prisons, and yet it has the biggest impact in terms of reducing reoffending and improving the well-being and the confidence of people in prison so they can then reintegrate with society. And if you then focused on getting them jobs, again I have a chapter in the book which shows the correlation between employment and crimes to begin with and reoffending. And that in itself is hugely reduced. Another reason, of course, why crime has been going down is because people are getting richer, and there is more to lose if you commit a crime. So if you get people back into employment, they have more to lose by reoffending. Of course, there are some necessities, such as housing, relationship, and so on. But if you assume those are there, then employment, education and employment are the biggest and surest ways in which we can get society actually to have fewer victims. So it's not a case of not punishing people who committed a crime. It is a case of how do we reduce crime generally and the cost to society. And it is not by putting people in prison, particularly not women, because the cost of caring after the children is immense, and the likelihood of those children becoming NEETs, which is not in employment, education or training when they get older, and then committing crimes or having antisocial behavior, is hugely greater than those who haven't been separated from their parents, particularly from their mothers. That's what the book argues, and argues for reform and a rethink, and I'd like to think that at least it has encouraged a lot more debate like the one we're having today. Thank you.
I just want to pick up a couple of themes there. I mean, one is just for people to know that Vicky talked about women in prison being the primary carers of children, and the kind of most recent figures are that about 18,000 children are separated from their mothers as a result of imprisonment every year, and I think that clearly has a massive impact, not just on the women's response to their experience in prison, but of course on those children, but also in the cost in terms of the public purse, because a lot of those children end up in the care system, and we know statistically that people in prison, there's an overrepresentation of people who've been in care who then end up in the criminal justice system. But I just want to touch on a couple of things, because there was something that really had a resonance with me, something you wrote in the book, where you said that most offenders, in the context of women, most offenders are victims as well as offenders, and they have offended precisely because they're victims, and how you hadn't thought that you would be so struck by the senselessness of it all for most women, and that had a real resonance for me in terms of the work that Inquest has done on deaths of women in prison and the complex histories that those women have had in terms of mental health problems, drug and health problems, experience of domestic violence and abuse, and importantly, issues about poverty and inequality. I suppose my kind of question really is if you could kind of develop a little bit of that in the context of the women that you met in prison, but also what we know about women's response to prison, in particular the horrendous histories of self-harm, of suicides, but also women who die through really kind of appalling medical treatment and who die very prematurely. And I'd like to kind of you to discuss a little bit about that, because I think what Vicky's illustrated earlier on is about how much this issue of who women in prison are and the reality of their lives is so kind of hidden, and how the media tend to focus on, you know, the odd woman prisoner and the kind of, you know, the demonization of that individual woman, rather than the reality of the kind of group of women that we're talking about.
No, you're absolutely right. And of course, I looked at some of your figures, and the extraordinary statistic is that although women represent only 5% of the population in prison, they account, said, for a third, if not more, of self-harm. Of course, sometimes it will be successful and there will be suicide, but other times it won't be. And quite often, of course, it is a cry for help. And it was really quite worrying too among people that I met, sort of looking at sort of depression that they had. I would sort of walk past the phone booths, which are very, very expensive. This is what women work for during the week, so they can have enough money on their phone. That's how the system works. You get paid for the work you do. I had dining room duties, by the way, so relatively easy by comparison to others, because I opted it was decided between all of us, including the governors and so on, while I was in East Sutton Park, that because there were all these photographers out there who were constantly wanting to take pictures of me, it was better if I had an in-house job. So that is what I did, which meant really that I was wandering around quite a bit, and I could, as I was passing, see women cry over the phone or shout at their partners or try and get their children who were being bullied at school because their parents had gone to prison or their mother had gone to prison to to get a grip with a thing or thinking of how they can possibly help. I mean, that's a big issue for them in terms of the separation, let alone the costs. But it is an extraordinary statistic as well. I mean, first of all, the statistics that show that 37% of women who've been sentenced to prison say that they had contemplated taking their lives at some point before they go to prison. So it's a very, very large percentage by comparison to sort of everybody else. And some 40% have received treatment for mental health problems before they go to prison. So there is that too. And I would walk behind all these girls who'd be queuing up for methadone. Of course, there was loads of drug dependency that was in Holloway, certainly. By the time I would arrive and have my aspirins, you know, it was a light relief for the nurse who was dispersing all these things. And I was actually allowed to keep my aspirins, even in Holloway. Not that I'm aspirin dependent, by the way, in case anyone thinks that. But I have all this fear of being somewhere, and then I get a headache, and I haven't got anything to take, and then I have to wait by the time they unlock my cell to be able to get those medicines. But I was allowed them because I was perceived to be low risk, even though I was surrounded by all these people who really were not low risk from that point of view. They weren't risk to society, they were risk to themselves of doing something wrong. And that type of atmosphere, being locked up, being away from the children in particular, or from the outside world, and being out completely without any control of what is written about you, what is said about you, what happens to your children, except those phone calls, is the thing that you see all the time. And when I was in open prison, I had the luxury of having visits in the weekends, which was rather nice because they were outside the sort of... By the way, my open prison was, I have to say, it was a grade 2 Elizabethan manor in the middle of the Kent countryside, which was very cold, but actually much better than Holloway, which is also very cold. Where there were no lockups, no fences, and I had a room, and there was no lockup of the room either, and you could wander around until 11 or 12 o'clock at night. But everybody worked, and people worked either in the prison itself or they worked in London. So they would commute every day. And they would be allowed, which is an extraordinary thing, which I hadn't realized at all. They'd be allowed to use the internet while they were out. They would, for their work, they would have mobiles, they have emails, and they come back to prison in the evening, and they'd be back to being proper prisoners, where they wouldn't be allowed any of these things and get punished for speaking out too loudly. And it's occurred to me, what's the point of having these people there? There were no threat to society. They were not absconding. Let them be with their community and their children. But anyway, so one of those days, of the visitors who came in this rather nice environment, so much better than Holloway, in terms of the environment. Holloway, I thought, was pretty decent in terms of the way it dealt with this madhouse that they had over there. The partner of that girl with the baby came. It was 6 months old. And then the baby went off. And because of the photographers that I mentioned before, because it was quite early on in the open prison thing, they used the car to take us from the entrance to the place, where normally you walk. So I travelled back with her and put my arms around her because she was crying her eyes out. That evening, she tried to commit suicide. And she was sent back to open prison after she was... to closed prison. So imagine, you're trying to do that, and then for your own good, that was interesting, for her own good, she was sent back to closed prison. But can you imagine what sort of improvement that is? Mm-hmm. What this girl should have had is proper mental treatment and proper counselling. There wasn't any counsellor in East Southern Park. You had to be shipped out to get counsel. That was the sort of evidence of what happens when you're separated. And that's what most women were saying. You talked also about the sort of stigma, if you like, of being a woman and how you're dealt with, which is really rather interesting. And I talk about that in the book, and there's quite a lot of academic evidence to support it. But if you're a woman, there is a double whammy there in terms of the way you're treated. Because, of course, first of all, there aren't very many women offenders, or certainly not very many violent offenders. There are only about 100 violent women in prison. And yet, everyone knows the names of these women and has this impression that women are violent, which, of course, we're not. Nothing like as much as the men. There are 10,000 violent men in prison. Of course, they occasionally can do violent things, but they're not violent per se. They can be doing them under the influence of whatever drugs or whatever it is that they're under. So you don't actually have that effect, really. I mean, women generally, A, don't commit very many crimes, and B, they are generally not violent. And yet the impression that the judges and others have, and the newspapers, is that it's not yet, actually. It is because of it. Can I correct it? We're meant to be the fairer sex. We're meant to be the one that doesn't do anything wrong, who's a home carer and all that sort of stuff. And when they do something wrong, which is pretty common for men, it's perceived that if you've done something bad, then you must be really bad, because it's completely outside women's nature to be doing this. So it gets sensationalized in the press. What many of them found that I spoke to was, of course, their trial was in a local Crown Court somewhere around the country. And of course, as I say in the book, it depends where you end up. There's huge postcode lottery. In some places, you're 4 times as likely as a woman to receive a custodial sentence than in another county, which is extraordinary for the same thing. It gets written up in your local press in such a way that then they find it also incredibly difficult to get back, but it has a huge impact on their children and their family that's out there. And of course, they worry about that hugely while they're inside. And it's one of the reasons also why they self-harm.
Can you talk a little bit about how you think your experiences of prison differed from the majority of women who were there? Because I've read, in doing a little bit of background in terms of reading the book and looking at some of the newspapers, some people have described you as a celebrity prisoner, and what are you doing writing about prison when you were only in there for a couple of months and you were only in open conditions? And I would kind of like to hear what you say about that.
Well, the first thing to say is that those people who've written it, of course, who've written whatever they may have thought about all this, haven't been to prison themselves at all, not even a single day, in terms of being locked up. So, and somebody described this to me, said, well, if you're thrown into hot water once, you don't have to be thrown into hot water many times to know what it feels like. And you can get the measure of Holloway very, very quickly. But there is a point. I was very lucky that I didn't spend that long. But remember, the vast majority of women go to jail for just very few weeks. So it wasn't exceptional in any way. The second thing is this celebrity status. Of course, everyone knew what had happened, no doubt about that. And certainly, there's a lot of time spent when you're not working watching television. So they knew everything. People on the outside wrote that, in fact, I would get a very raw deal. It wasn't I was going to have a very nice time because I was a celebrity. It was I was going to have a terrible time because everyone would hiss as I would go past their cells, because I was, on average, richer than most of the people there, or so they thought. And because I was, for some reason, lots of people thought I was an MP. It was extraordinary. Which is really interesting, by association. So women have no status except by association, it seems, which is one of the themes maybe of this event, unless we really sort of show that it's different. So they all thought, interestingly enough, that I would have this terrible time. And when I wrote about the reality, which was that, in fact, women expressed huge solidarity with each other, and it wasn't just to me, I helped others, others were helping others, women talk to each other. They really support them. They understand the issues about separation from children. They're very much more sort of sympathetic of anyone else's problems. Yes, of course, there's a bit of bullying and bitching that goes on. You hear some of that. I didn't see very much of that. Certainly none of this addressed to me, and very little to anybody else, frankly. So when I write about that in fact, I was well treated. I would walk down the corridor. There is this thing called movement every day in Holloway. If you're lucky enough to find an excuse to leave your cell, you join this crowd of people, and as you pass the corridors, there are other people joining from the various cells, and then eventually, after going through lots of gates, locked, open, and so on, they let you in slowly. You peel off, and you've got to be very careful, because if you forget your exit, where you have to go, you've had it, because then you can't go, and you're stuck, you have to then go back. But anyway, if you go to the library, to education, to the gym, to health, so that's how you do it, or out for a little walk, half an hour a day. So people had heard I had come in, and as I was walking down, they'd say, I could hear them say, Vicky Pryce is coming. And I didn't know what to expect. And they came out, and they would shake my hand and hug me and say, is there anything you need? A terrible thing to have happened to you, and all that sort of stuff. And then they would congregate around me when I went outside and say, extraordinary that you come out. We thought you were going to hide in your in your cell and I want to mix with us. It never occurred to me to do that, of course. And then, of course, they would tell me all the stories. So a lot of what I have in the book is what has come out of them just opening up and talking, and also of them helping. It was through the help of these people that I managed to get the library without having a proper library pass, that I managed to do all sorts of things while I was there, that I got 5 blankets instead of the 1 that I would have frozen on day 1, because of the kindness. But they didn't deal just with me like that. They dealt like that with everyone who came, and that was the most extraordinary thing about Holloway, and that was what I also saw in the other place. Now, so I come out and say that, and then of course you're attacked for that. So, you can't please people, obviously, but this was the reality, and I've written about exactly what happened.
I mean, I think one of the telling things is when you talk about the fact that majority of women are in prison for such a short amount of time, but the devastating impact that those short-term sentences have, because you were somebody with your own home, you had a supportive family, you were financially independent, and for so many women, they go to prison, they lose their home, they lose their children, any kind of mental health problems or other problems are exacerbated. And I kind of want to slightly move on before we open it up to questions to talk about something that you've said. I mean, the thing I think is very important about the book is that, the arguments and evidence that you use in the book are well known to those of us who've been working in this field for many years. And I was involved with Baroness Corsten's review of women in the criminal justice system, and that happened because of the public disquiet around the deaths of 6 women in Style Prison in Cheshire. And I should say, as a result of some remarkable campaigning by a woman some of you may well have heard of, called Pauline Campbell, whose daughter, Sarah Campbell, died in Style in the most horrendous circumstances. All of the 6 women who died in Style had mental health problems and drug dependencies. And at the time, there was no methadone program operating in Style. So all those women took their own lives, 4 through hangings, 2 through overdoses of prescribed and medication that they'd acquired. It was absolutely shameful what was going on, and it was only until the 6th death that the prison service actually did anything about it and introduced a methadone program. But the government were then forced to do something, and so Baroness Corsten conducted a review, and I think all of those of us who worked on that were very encouraged at the time by the fact that she recognised that the women's prison system needed a complete overhaul, that we needed to dismantle the prison service and the prison system in its entirety and have small custodial units for the small women who needed to remain, and invest in community-based alternatives that could address the many reasons that had resulted in women going to prison in the first time. The problem with it was, though, that I think the concerns about kind of tabloid response to the report resulted in the government rejecting the key recommendation, which was the complete overhaul. And so the most radical recommendation was dumped in favour of a more kind of reformist agenda, which resulted in some very, very good investment in some of the women's centres. But ultimately, the kind of argument about getting rid of prisons was rejected. And I think the important thing about the book is that it's given us now the economic arguments that show just how expensive prison is, the fact that it doesn't work. If anything, it damages and does nothing to address the problem. And that really leads me to the question about how it's kind of tabloid populism rather than rational policy that drives the agenda, and that's a direct quote of yours. And if you could say something about that, and why it is you think that the prison is always seen as the answer, and that we can kind of put, very damaged people into a very damaging environment and forget about them and not address the fact that it further damages and sometimes leads to death.
Well, it's quite interesting. But, one of the very important things that, for me personally, the Baroness Corsten recommended, which has certainly been taken up in Holloway, is there's no strip searching when you enter. There's still strip searching in men's prisons, but it's really quite interesting. So at least you feel you enter something with your dignity intact, and I think that's very, very important. And it sets the scene, if you like, for how your well-being while you're in there, and that's really significant. But you're absolutely right. There hasn't been the sort of dramatic change that there should have been. Although, of course, the Justice Select Committee keeps saying that we should not be putting women in prison for short sentences. My worry, of course, about that is that the judge will say, fine, okay, we'll put them in there for longer. for things that really they shouldn't even be in prison to begin with. But it's interesting what you've picked up about the press. And we have to be a little bit careful because the political classes really do think that they have to demonstrate that they're tough in law and order, and that's what seems to happen. Remember that the big increase in the prison population, the recent prison increase, happened under Labour, when we had loads of women ministers there. And the tabloids, in a way, yes, occasionally they guide policy, but they've taken their cue, if you like, from what the politicians have been saying. So we just have to be careful not to attack them too much. And there are indeed a number of women who should be punished for what they have done, as there are a number of men. And you know, in my case, I did something wrong. I never sort of begrudged the decision that was made, and I've done my bit. But of course, a number of us and lots of others could have been dealt with in a slightly different way, possibly. But the issue about the press and the population is whether the politicians really think that they're reflecting what the population wants. The population wants a bit of punishment, fine. What they haven't had explained to them is that other forms of punishment, such as community orders, are actually more effective, cheaper, much cheaper at a time when everyone is cutting down the budgets, and more effective in terms of reducing reoffending than sending people to prison. And the evidence is there, and it's just not used enough. You know, we still have prison ministers saying that community orders are not real punishment. And the moment they say that, what are the tabloids to do but to take that point as well? So, but the interesting thing about this whole thing, in my view, is that the public are not stupid. If you ask them, perhaps, you know, there's a general feeling, of course, that we should be putting more people to prison and for longer. That, you know, there's a general. If you ask them, should people be punished for what they're doing, they would generally say yes. If you explain to them what it is that women have gone to prison for, and there was this big survey done by Mori. When they ask that question, the answer is, oh my God, there shouldn't be prison at all. There should be alternatives because of the impact of the children, because of what they've done, which is trivial, because etc. So if the facts are explained, the population understands it, and yet the politicians seem to be too scared of giving the impression that they're not actually tough on crime. And then the point you made at the end of your question, which was the view that you can just put people away and that solves the problem. Of course, people come out. You know, these women who've gone for a few weeks come out. These men who may have committed something slightly more serious or have committed a similar type of offence come out. I mean, we must remember that most of the women in prison are in there for shoplifting. Absolutely. I mean, this is hardly a sort of huge danger to society. But of course, we don't want anyone to be stealing, and they shoplift for reasons that we've just enumerated, whether it's poverty, drugs, alcohol, their pimp, or whatever. Sometimes they know what they're doing, fine. But they come out, and they're everywhere and all around us. And what is more, what the population hasn't quite realized, and I have the data in the book, is that only 3 out of 100 offences ever end up in court. And there are many offences, you know, people are in court for doing things that lots of other people do on the outside, and they haven't been caught. And the people who've been in come out, and unless they're helped to make sure they have a job, and they're back with their families and what have you, then there will be a drain on society, and they might, not only might they reoffend, but they also cost us an awful lot of money. So the population doesn't seem to, it needs to be explained to the people who read the newspapers that actually you haven't solved the problem by sending them to prison. They may have gone away for a bit. There are other people who could offend just as easily all around you, and do, and they will be out again. And they come out. There are 200,000 people who go through the system every year. So that isn't understood, that isn't explained, and I think a lot more of that. I think if people know the facts, they would think differently.
And I think that's absolutely true in the context of community-based alternatives, the women's centres that offer a kind of holistic approach where women can go and get advice on, you know, drug and alcohol use, get help with mental health problems, debt counselling, issues around children. And I mean, some of the projects that I'm aware of that Clean Break and Women in Prison are involved in, you know, they absolutely do make a difference, and they stop women offending in the future. So